Welcome to Kevin Makes Cool Things. I'm Kevin, and today I am making Anisphia's magical sword from the magical revolution of a reincarnated princess and a genius young lady, which started airing earlier this month. The only thing that might have a tiny impact on the project is I haven't seen a single episode. I was familiar with this series because of the manga. When I saw the anime was coming out, I recalled this sword and thought it might be cool to 3D print, but I didn't have time to wait around for the episodes to start. To do a project like this, I would generally give myself at least 4 weekends, with 3 weeks in between. That first weekend, I would generally spend doing the 3D modeling. Throughout that first week, I would be printing the various pieces. That second weekend, I would start attaching everything together, which would continue throughout that second week. Because the stuff I do is rarely nice and square, I often have to attach just one piece together, give it 24 hours to dry, and then attach the next one, so this can easily take a couple of days. That third weekend, I would generally start doing serious sanding and adding wood filler. For that third week, I would be adding primer and doing the painting. That final fourth weekend, I generally set aside to make these videos, which really aren't my forte and take a surprising amount of time. That assumes that everything goes perfectly, and I don't have any major obligations on the weekends, and I don't have to work late. Since I was doing this over the holidays, I decided to reliably post this in January to go along with the release of the anime. I needed to find my references in November, do most of the modeling in December, and then just take January to do the printing and finishing. When I was looking for references back in late November, I could really only find 2 images. The first was a general promotional image for the series. The second focused on the character designs. The sword is present in both of these, but neither is a usable reference for modeling. In these images, the sword is in its active state, where magic is being channeled through it, but I'm going to be making it in its inactive state, when it looks more like a normal sword. In these images, I can't see the blade or some of the other details. I did some research and found possible references from both the manga and the light novel. I decided to go with the light novel, partly because the manga version had some complicated details on the handle, which looked like a pain, but also because, when in doubt, I'd rather go with the original. Now that I had my reference image, I opened up GIMP. I adjusted the image so it was centered and level, and then started tracing over it. To make sure everything was perfectly mirrored, I only traced half of this, and then made a copy of that layer and flipped it. I moved into Blender and made a couple of attempts to model this, which isn't unusual for me. My first attempt was at the start of December, and it went fine. I couldn't get back to this until the end of the month because of the normal array of holiday activities, and when I did, I decided to just start over from scratch. I find that taking a couple of days to think about something like this, or a few weeks in this case, often helps things gel in my brain, and I'll get better results in less time by just starting over. Modeling this came down to 3 things. First, the subdivision surface modifier, which is what makes all of this beautifully smooth. Second is mirror modifiers, which is why I only need to model 1/4 to 1/8 of the hilt, depending on what area you're looking at. Third was sanity checks. I checked that all the details were tall enough to print properly, which has been a problem on other projects. I also checked the length of the handle and ended up extending it, because I realized it would only be long enough to hold with one hand, and we see the character wielding this with both hands. To determine the dimensions for this sword, I measured my wife's hands and then consulted my reference image. I'm a fairly large guy, which is fine when I'm making stuff from solo leveling, which is meant to be handled by a man, but this character is a teenage girl and is presumably a fair bit smaller than me. For all of my solo leveling daggers, I made the grips 1 inch in diameter, or 25 millimeters, because that's what feels comfortable in my hand. My wife is more comfortable with 3/4 inch diameter, so that's what I aim for on this project. I split the model into pieces for printing by overlapping it with some cubes and doing an intersect modifier. I also added some small channels, so bits of nail can go between these pieces to help align them during gluing. Then I exported everything and I was ready for printing. If you watched last month's video, you're probably aware that I had some issues with glass flakes coming off of my bed. Instead of replacing the bed, which is what I planned to do, I just ended up sticking something on top of it, which contains the problem and allows me to keep printing. It's not a permanent solution, but it works for now. After printing, I started attaching the pieces together. I divided this sword into sections and then split every section down the middle, so I could print them all with the details facing up, so they wouldn't require any supports. This meant that I had to glue the sections together before I could start doing any significant assembly. Conventional clamps wouldn't have worked well on most of these pieces, so I went straight for rubber bands and zip ties. As I was working on this, I ran out of the two-part epoxy I had been using and switched to a different brand. The old stuff was clear, but this wasn't, which would come back to bite me later on. Because of the unusual shapes involved, I could really only attach one piece at a time. So every night for a week, I'd set aside 5 minutes to mix up some adhesive, attach the piece, and then wait 24 hours before I could do any more work on it. As I went, I would drill out the channels I'd added. These are perfect for a small bit of finishing nail to go between the pieces to align them during gluing. Once everything was attached together, I did a quick pass with my Dremel tool. There were some rough areas and spots where the pieces were misaligned by maybe a millimeter. I could have handled this with hand sanding, but a Dremel tool is so much easier. While using the Dremel tool, I accidentally removed some details. I kinda forgot this was intentional, and thought this was supposed to be a smooth curve, so I just sanded it down. At this point, I wasn't going to reprint everything and spend another week slowly assembling this, so I decided to continue on. Next, I applied some wood filler. This shouldn't be as necessary if you have a well-calibrated printer, but my print quality isn't going to win any awards. Afterwards, I sanded everything by hand using sandpaper and some small files. Because of all the small details, this took me around an hour. I decided to go back and do another round of wood filler and some more sanding, which I often do if I'm going to be working with metallic colors. Some of the joins between the different sections were still visible, and there were some rough areas. These wouldn't have been an issue if I were painting this a darker color, like a black or a brown, but I'm planning to use silver for the blade and gold for the hilt, which are going to make these small issues really pop. I used some spray-on sandable primer before painting this. This does a great job of filling small holes and highlights anything that needs more work. At this point, I was going to start painting. There were some areas which could have used a little more attention, but it was pretty minor. I decided to put in a little bit more effort, because we all have New Year's resolutions, and one of mine is to do a better job finishing my prints. Before moving on to painting, I do a quick pass with some high-grit sandpaper, then wipe everything down with a damp paper towel to collect any remaining dust. Painting was pretty uneventful. I generally do 3 coats for each color, but the gold required a 4th coat to get really good coverage. The blade had 2 circular gems on it, which I had a plan for. My secret weapon were glass cabochons. Ever since I made my chthonic key from Hades, which I don't think turned out very well, I've been putting a lot of thought into how to do rounded gems well. I think glass cabochons are going to be the answer, and I'm actually planning to remake this in a future video to prove it, but that's a topic for another time. Originally, I was going to make these transparent blue gems, because when I zoom in on the images from the anime, I can see a couple of pixels of blue. I realized this would be a problem because the 2-part epoxy I'm using now, which is the only adhesive I have which might work well on glass, isn't clear. At this point, the anime had a few episodes out, so I did some googling and found an image of the sword from the 3rd episode. This is probably what I would have used for a reference image if I'd had some more time. Turns out these gems are normally silver, so I'm guessing they turn blue along with the blade once you channel magic into the sword. I originally intended to put some 10mm diameter cabochons into these areas, but the fit was a little too tight on the printed version, so I went for 8mm. I scratched up the surface of these with some sandpaper, and then applied the same silver metallic paint I used on the blade. After the paint dried, I used 2-part epoxy to stick these on. Bits of the epoxy ended up being visible around these gems, which was incredibly frustrating because I thought I was done. I applied a bit of gold paint to cover this up, and then did a few touch-ups with the silver. It's not perfect, but it's not too noticeable unless you're up close. As the final step, I applied some spray-on matte sealer, and this was finally done. Overall, I'm pretty happy with how this turned out. It's not perfect, but this central area is some of my better finishing work. If I could go back and change one thing, I would put more time and effort into these areas. There were some imperfections here which were really magnified once I added the gold paint. If you want to make your own, I'll post all the files on Thingiverse. There'll be a link in the video description. If you enjoyed this video, then please give it a like and let YouTube's algorithm know it's worth watching. If you enjoy my work and want to see my other projects, then go ahead and subscribe to the channel.